hope you're doing well. David and Christy are back for another episode of the Innovative Leader Podcast. The summer has just been crazy, and so it's good to be back and try to get in a rhythm again. Christy, I hope you're doing well, and I hear your family's got some struggles with COVID, and so our thoughts and prayers are with them completely. I know, I told you my wife had gone through COVID, and so it's all around. It's going all over the place, and it's never an easy place to be the spouse of someone or the family of someone who's going through some difficult things like that. So today we want to talk about difficult conversations. Mm-hmm. How do we have those? Or why do we have those? Why don't we have those conversations? Why do we need to have those conversations when we're in leadership? And then, so today we're going to talk about three different things. One is why people don't have those tough or difficult conversations within their staff or within their organization. We're going to talk about, some principles on having those conversations, and then the cost of not having those conversations as well. And so today, Christy, one of the things I would like to start off with, just kind of a general question, is how do we define a tough or difficult conversation? Because sometimes we have that in our head that it's firing somebody. And it's much more than that. We have tough conversations, need to have tough conversations at every level, and not just to fire somebody, but to get things done, to make sure people are on track, that accountability aspect. So let's talk about real quick. Give me your thoughts on what a difficult conversation is.
Yeah. So I was doing a retreat with a client of mine, a strategic planning retreat, and we were talking about these challenging conversations and how, when I think about tough conversations, and I guess we can all define that a little bit differently. Sometimes people who are already bold and courageous leaders who have really truth-telling, candid conversations, a tough conversation is different on that scale versus somebody else who's maybe very introverted and quiet, a harmony type person. You could have a tough conversation deciding where to go to dinner with a friend. It could be over here where you're like,
oh man,
I don't want to offend them, and I want to do what they want to do. So you could be over here thinking that's a tough conversation, when that has nothing to do with what it would be a really tough conversation for some people. Right. Closing a company, firing people, laying off people, making massive decisions that change the culture or what is happening for an organization, what is required for people in an organization, tend to be really tough conversations. Financial decisions that have major ramifications and things like that are more tough conversations. But so to me, a tough conversation in leadership really is about a leader's ability to say what needs to be said. Now, this isn't permission to just fire hose somebody. This isn't permission to be a jerk, which is why a lot of conversations go bad, because a lot of people who feel comfortable having tough conversations, honestly, are kind of jerky people. They're unfiltered, they're aggressive, they're assertive, and they just fire hose people, and they're like, I don't know what the rest of you have a problem with. That's just say it the way it is, as if that's okay. And that's not okay.
It's not.
And so those people having that kind of a bad conversation teaches the rest of the world to be really eggshell walky and squishy about having tough conversations, because they don't want to be that person. And so there's kind of these polar ends of that person who's a jerk and this person who's kind of overly soft in a way. And where are we in the middle? And honestly, most leaders fall somewhere in the middle. And I think a tough conversation is the ability to have the courage to say what needs to be said in order to move things forward.
Yeah, that's a good definition. I mean, you're going to have tough conversations about so many different things. I think, and we'll talk about some other things about that in a minute, but I think that's a great definition. I I don't know that I would change anything about it, to be honest. So I really do like that. All right, so let's talk about why we don't have those conversations. Why, what are your thoughts on the why? I mean, I'll give you mine real quick. So I think people are afraid of conflict, and so it's easier to not have those conversations than to have them. I think the other thing is we think, let's just give them a little bit more time. Maybe that could be, put in another category. But I mean, I've had those thoughts as, maybe if I do something, maybe if I try to help spend more time with them, help them, train them better, those kinds of things, maybe they'll catch it. So that's kind of the second one. And then the other is, I'm just too busy. I've got a lot of things to do, and you just never get around to it, which I think in many cases is actually a reflection of the first one. You don't prioritize it because you don't want to have that conflict. You don't want to have that. So I think those are just off the top, as I've been thinking about it and looking at some things today, I think those are probably, 2 or 3 reasons why, I think we keep from having those conversations.
Yeah, that's great. Just to piggyback or build on that, I would agree with conflict. We know that conflict, they say public speaking is the number one fear for people, generally, is public speaking. However, I don't know that people would acknowledge per se that they fear conflict as much as they just prefer to avoid conflict. They don't really see it as this, like, oh, I'm afraid of conflict. They don't even acknowledge it as a fear. They're just like, oh, it's not my preference to be in conflict. I prefer harmony. I prefer getting along. Okay, great. You know what? Like, I'm a high D profile, and sometimes people misunderstand, I think, Ds as enjoying conflict. I will say, I do think there are Ds who enjoy conflict. But I will say for myself as a high D, I don't enjoy conflict. I don't like conflict. I just less enjoy squishiness, like not being able to move forward because we haven't done what needs to be done. So I will engage in conflict more because it needs to happen, versus, to me, the insanity of doing the same thing and not getting results because you haven't had that conversation is literally insane. So anyway, the whole fear of conflict point that you made, I agree with that. In our DISC profile, the personality profile that I like to use a lot, there's different groups that have broken it different ways. But one of the statistics is that if you took their assessment and kind of extracted it across the world population, that roughly 63% of the world's population would fall in alignment with the S personality profile. So the D and the I are external, extroverted profiles. The S and the C are introverted profiles. Generally, introverts have a harder time dealing with conflict than extroverts. And then if you take that personality profile and you look and you're like, okay, so 63% of the world's population, hypothetically extracted, right, would be S's. What does that mean? Is over half of the world's population would rather not have a conflict. They're stabilizers, steady, status quo, keep it simple. And now S's are not bad. S's, if you're an S and you're hearing this, and I think you have S too, I am not making that a negative. S's are beautiful. We need all profiles, but S's in general are very uncomfortable with conflict, because it is the opposite of harmony. It creates so much stress and turmoil in their body. They will overtake responsibility. They will overdo themselves. They will work harder and longer to avoid a conflict than to address a conflict.
Right. No, absolutely. I listen, I'm right there. That is me. But I will tell you that, um, over time, I have learned not to enjoy conflict, um, but to initiate it in those conversations when I thought they were necessary.
Absolutely. Well, and I
And
think that's the whole point around difficult conversations in leadership. As we
yeah,
grow in our leadership, regardless what your style is, we learn to have these crucial conversations. And
yeah,
just as a note, that's a really good book. If you are someone who has a hard time with these difficult conversations, Crucial Conversations is a fantastic book. It's,
yeah,
a couple years old. It's been out a bit, but it's not dated. It is a great book. So
right,
Crucial Conversations, and then followed up, read Crucial first, but then there is Crucial Confrontation, which I believe they've rewritten. So anyhow, there's a couple books, but read Crucial Conversations first is a fabulous book, because you're right. Any leader knows those conversations are important.
yeah. I mean, it goes against my grain. It goes against the grain, within me to initiate those kinds of things. But at some point, what I have discovered, at least in my own life, is at some point the cost of not having the conversation is greater than the cost of having the conversation.
Absolutely. Huge. And we'll get to that
Yeah,
in the second point.
yeah,
That is so true. And my big pet peeve, but I think there's a few more reasons why people don't have conversations. So
sure,
one, I agree with you, fear of conflict, natural personality. It doesn't feel right. So you would naturally avoid it because it feels physically challenging to do that. I think
right,
another thing you mentioned about more time, and I agree with that as well. And I would say, in addition to that, that people can think that they are being patient. And so in it, they don't have the tough conversation, to your point, because they are trying to give it more time, but also they convince themselves that they are being patient. And so that feels more noble, to not have
right,
the confrontation. Like, you're not doing anything wrong by not having the conversation. You're just being patient. So that feels noble. But the thing is that we always have to be discerning. Am I being passive? And if you're like, hey, if I just hang out with this person, I just had a conversation with a client today about that, where they were talking about something that they were like, they were trying to they wanted to influence in a positive way. And so if they just showed up and they were influencing, would people catch on how to be more productive? I don't think so. Because the reality is, if they don't realize that they need to be more productive, they don't realize that there's a problem with their productivity, and you show up and you're this productivity engine, nobody's like, oh my gosh, I think I want to be like them.
yeah,
Usually people are like, oh my gosh, they're so crazy.
they are.
They don't look at that and go, I think I'd like to be like them. So
No, yeah,
usually, go ahead.
no. I was going to say, um, I I just assume, when I come into an organization, I assume people. I mean, I assume people want to be like me because that's who I am, and um, so I come in and man, I'm working and leading and doing doing all these kinds of things, and I look around and I'm seeing people go, and I go, what's going on here, and so that's you can't just it's not leadership by osmosis.
Right. Right. Yes. I think that's well said. It's not osmosis, and people aren't going to catch it. And it's an interesting thing too. I think we all are guilty of, if you really think about it, I think we're all guilty of that. Even when I think about StrengthsFinder training, they will say in StrengthsFinder training that you can identify your strengths because it's the thing that you notice. So if you go to church and you're like, wow, people really don't greet, that's because you are a greeter. You're
Right.
good at greeting. So you notice that you weren't greeted. Somebody who isn't as good at that doesn't really care about that, and they don't necessarily notice that. So we tend to notice what we're good at. So then if you are showing up with your strength, doing what you're good at, thinking that it's going to rub off on other people, it's just a fat out fallacy. Like,
Yeah.
they didn't notice it. They don't think it's important. And just because you're great at it doesn't mean that they think that they need to be great at it because you're
Right.
great at it.
Yeah.
So without the conversation, that is absolutely a reason why they don't, but it is a full out fallacy that doesn't work. So agree with that. But I'm just saying that passive, they think that passively it's going to catch on, but it's
Right.
not. Another thing that you talked about was the too busy. And I agree with that, but I'm going to put that in a whole category of excuses. The reason why people don't have tough conversations is a myriad of excuses, like they're too busy, it's not my job, they don't
Right.
report to me, they do report to me, but then I'm micromanaging, that they just started, they're new, oh, they've been here a year, but they're still learning. We will make excuses forever instead of having conflict. That's ridiculous. Like,
Yep.
how long should someone be onboarding? I mean, is 12 months too long? Yeah, I kind of think it is. But we will keep making excuses. So that's one. And then you touched on this one, but I want to re-highlight it, is self-doubt. And that sometimes when we need to have some tough conversations, we suddenly can get very pricked by self-doubt. And we start to go, well, how do I know that I'm right? How do I know, is my way, is it really my way versus their way? Maybe they're just doing it their way. Maybe I haven't given enough time and I'm demanding too much, or I'm being too assertive or too aggressive, or maybe this is unreasonable. Was this in their job description? Should I be asking them to do this? We can get completely peppered with a different thoughts of self-doubt that keeps us from having the conversation, because all of a sudden we feel like we don't have enough reason to have that very uncomfortable conversation.
Yeah. I think another one that I kind of thought of as we were talking too is, I think another one is we feel like we're not being kind to other people.
Yeah, great.
You know, here's a person, they're going to lose their job, or they're going to take a demotion, or, you know, they've got stuff going on at home and don't want to bother them with, you know, these kinds of things. So I think sometimes we just feel like, you know, that now's not the right time. I'm going to be unkind. This is not the kind thing to do.
Right.
And so, you know, those are a reason we just don't have it. The problem is when they continue on that, and, you know, life is great and they're out boating every weekend and having and enjoying life, and we still don't have those conversations. So.
Yeah, so let's move into that. And I would agree. I think not only is it unkind, but then people, it's kind of a two-way thing where you put yourself in someone's shoes because you're trying to be human-centric, which is a wonderful leadership thing to do.
Right.
So you're putting yourself in someone's shoes, but then you start to self-identify that it feels unkind, it feels mean, it feels like a jerk. It reminds me of tough love and how tough love never feels loving. Yeah. And again, tough love isn't about you, it's about what is right versus like, you know, I need to put them in their place. No, that is being mean. So you have to be able to self-assess if you're being a jerk or if this is tough love, and really having a conversation that needs to be had for the betterment of that other person and what you're up to.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so let's move to, so I'm sure there's more reasons, but those are plenty of reasons. And I think common reasons why we don't have tough conversations. And frankly, I'm going to say most conversations, tough conversations, don't happen until well after they should have happened.
Right.
So what are some reasons for the cost of not having tough conversations?
Well, there's a personnel cost in that. I've seen it recently where some conversations should have been had with the leader and they weren't, and as a result, people under that leader left. Really good people left And so there's some personnel costs there, which that's experience, that's knowledge, there's all kinds of things that go along with losing someone simply because the conversations were not had. There's a financial cost to that in many cases, where they could be wasting resources, a resource cost. They're wasting resources, they're wasting time, they're keeping other people from doing their job and doing it well. Those are, I think that's another category, another cost. And then there's also opportunity cost, where opportunities are available if things are done and decisions are made, and so you lose the opportunity to patent something or to get first to market, and of course all the impact of all of that happens. For me, in most of the situations I've been in, it is your inability to do your job is putting so much pressure on me to do my job and your job, then it's better just for you to go away.
What do you mean not?
Like, well, I mean, you're trying to get that person to do their job,
Right.
or to learn how to do this. And so we've hired you, we brought you on, you're supposed to be doing X, Y, and Z, and you're not. So I'm having to cover X, Y, and Z in addition to A, B, C, D, and F. And so why should I pay you to not do your job? Or why should I have you in this position where you're not doing anything? It's costing me money. It's wearing me out because I'm having to cover two different positions. So let's just move you. Either I've talked to you. We're going to get rid of you and bring someone in who can do your job, and it's a release off of me.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing because, like, let's assume that you did have that tough conversation and then it didn't get better. Or let's say you didn't have that tough conversation and it wasn't getting better because they didn't know. So it just kept getting worse. But either way, there's this pressure on you. And I think sometimes people will kind of ball it up and, they'll get that courage to have one tough conversation and they really needed another one, or they needed designed accountability,
right,
or they needed a follow-up to the, okay, we're gonna have this conversation. So you're going to work on that. Let's follow up in a week and see how it's going. How are we measuring if you're doing better? We haven't set, I'm getting into the next one, but we haven't set measurables on how we know if it's improving. We haven't set a checkpoint. So then you had to work so hard to have that initial first tough conversation. You never have it again. And now you're exhausted. But I think what I wanted to get to with that is just it makes it confusing to make decisions, because then you're like, well, did we have the tough conversation? Did we have enough tough conversations? Did I need to write them up? What really is the deal, right? And I think you're right that there is this cost when we don't have clear tough conversations with measurables, with follow-up. It makes it difficult to make decisions because there is that resource cost, there is that burden, there is the opportunity cost. And then, now you're caught saying, well, the violation of Simon Sinek about, always value your people, always invest in your people. And you just scrapped a person because you weren't able to have a tough conversation. It's possible that they weren't skilled and they weren't in the right seat on the bus. That's possible. But if you have the tough conversations, you figure that out and you get them on the right seat. If you don't have the tough conversations, you just move people around trying to get them in a place where they're not going to cause problems, or you eliminate them and don't really give them a chance because you didn't have the tough conversation.
No, I absolutely. And from my experience, I've always had the conversation, and then waited, gave them the time to do some things, and it didn't happen. And so it was time to go.
Right.
But you see that, but I think those, that moving around
Mhm.
is ironically inherent in some industries. I think it's inherent in the education industry. Whether it's union or not, school districts don't like to fire people. They will move them, and sadly enough, many times they move them up in the organization just to get them out of that to get them out. They'll move a principal to the central office just to get them away from that school because they're incompetent in that role. Oddly enough, I've seen that, and that's sad. But it's because they don't want to have that tough conversation.
But that's so fascinating and a really great insight, because I don't think it's immune to the education industry.
Mm-mm.
And I think when we look at, I still have not been able to find that statistic on, there is some statistic that talks about, it's an evaluation from like the Gallup organization or Pew Research or something like that. And it talks about how many leaders are considered great leaders. So on the scale, and then people are assessing their leaders and what percent of leaders in corporate America today are really great leaders. And it's some sad, crazy statistic, like under 25% are great leaders. Like it's some horrific 70 to 80% of leaders are literally below a C, like a bad leader. And then you're like, well, why do we have so much stuff on leadership? Because there's so many bad leaders. Why are people hating leaders? Because there's so many bad leaders. And what you just said is why, because leadership, you move them out of the trench. So if you're not producing in the trench, you move them over the trench, which is worse because now they're supposed to be responsible for the trench when they couldn't even do the trench.
Right. No, exactly. I think you're right. I think it's more than just education. I think it's in a lot of industries. You elevate incompetence to get rid of, and it becomes, what's funny is it gets revealed.
Right.
So anyway.
Okay, but that right there is the golden tough conversation.
Yeah.
And are we willing to have that conversation? So take that scenario. Someone was incompetent. They're promoted out of the trench into leadership. Everybody in the trench is going, what the heck? How did that person get promoted to the motorcycle over the trench when they couldn't even do their job in the trench? But we don't have the tough conversations because really tough conversations are not just top down. Tough conversations are just in the petri dish of the work world.
Yep.
And so if as a team member, and sometimes I get it, I understand that when you feel like a minion, that you feel like your job is at jeopardy if you have that tough conversation, that you don't have a voice to say that, you don't want to get on the hit list, like it's bad if you have that tough conversation. I understand that. But if we don't have the tough conversations, that's a tough conversation. Hey, help me understand what we promote here, because I'm interested in doing a great job, working really hard over here in the trench. And I saw that, John Smith was doing this, but then he was promoted to leadership. That's really interesting. I have some concerns about John Smith managing me because he actually did a horrible job next to me. And I don't think he understands my job, but now he's leading me. And I'm struggling to understand how that's going to work. That's a fair conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, real quick.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. I was going to say real quick, let's jump onto the principles for having those conversations.
Oh yeah. Okay, really quick. I just want to say, I love this analogy. After our big freeze in Texas, we had some trees in our backyard die. And so I'd asked Mike to cut down this dead tree that, after months, it obviously was not coming back. Yeah. But there was some growth at the base of the tree while the tree was trying to survive. So there was some growth at the base. So he, of course, cuts off the top of the tree and all of the growth except for one sprig. And he leaves it. And I'm like, why did you leave that? And he's like, well, until I have time to get the stump out, we'll just leave that one sprig. And of course, after a couple of weeks, it's worse. It's worse than the dead tree. There's a huge mangle of things that had grown out of the one branch that was left.
Right.
And I said, okay, that looks worse. Can you please remove it all? So he trims it again. And because he thought it was funny, he left one branch again. And to me, I was like, inside, I was like, so irritated, because it just honestly is irritating. It is the essence of not dealing with something and taking care of something and wasting time and perpetuating an ongoing problem. But inside, I was like, this is such a great example for tough conversations and not dealing with conflict or problems. And when you don't deal with it, it literally gets bigger. So when we feel like, oh man, this is too hard to deal with, would you like to 10x this problem?
Yeah.
Then deal with it. If you can't deal with one M&M, you don't want to deal with 10. If you can't deal with one branch, you don't want to deal with 20. Deal with it. If it's too big at this little minutia, not dealing with it simply multiplies while you're not paying attention, while you're being patient, while you are, being slightly weak and being able to deal with it. And so, yes, let's move on to how to deal with it then.
So having that conversation, I think there are some important things that we need to do. I think the first one is to be clear, to be clear in the concerns and the issues, and to not fire hose somebody, as you say. I love that phrase. But let's come and let's nip it in the bud, and let's start with one, and then if we need to have another conversation, if it's a different issue, then let's be clear about about that. I think we also need to have part of that needs to be some affirmation. I mean, you can't just beat somebody up and be mean. You need to affirm them in the things that they're doing well, assuming they are doing things well.
Mm-hmm.
I also think you need to put on your human hat, and that's part of it. You've got to realize you're dealing with a human being, and they may be going through something that you just don't know about. I think that goes back to, however, other leadership things we've talked about of knowing your people and being in relationship with them, and having the freedom for them to come, the safe space for them to come and talk to you, or that about what's going on in their life. I mean, you don't have to be best buds and keep a diary of everything that's happening, but to kind of know what's going on in their lives. Mm-hmm. So there's that human hat that you have to have. I think the other thing that you have to expect is you have to expect an emotional reaction. People are going to get defensive. So you have to expect that, and you have to be prepared for that. I think you have to listen, and I'm going at these in no particular order.
Sure.
Listen to them, and just let them share their perspective on what you said. Be an active listener, and listen and see what they might say about it, because you could be wrong on. They may be doing things and you just don't know they're doing them. Mm-hmm. I've had that situation happen. I think you've got to act decisively, though, when the pattern is there, when things have you've had multiple conversations and they are not listening, then I think you have to be decisive in what you're doing. Mm-hmm. Whatever that might be. So I think the measurables that you're going to probably jump on are going to be important as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's good. I would add, I think that's a good list. It's a great list. I would add, before starting any of it, I think one of the most important leadership skills today is emotional intelligence, which includes self-management.
Yeah.
And I think that you have to, when you think there is a reason for a tough conversation, you have to assess, is this about me? Are they just bugging me and getting under my skin?
Right.
Or is this really about them? And is this violating an agreement that we had? Did we not have an agreement? Did I not communicate clearly? What part of this is my responsibility? And,
Yep.
you know, we say that a leader can always take 10% of the responsibility for not communicating in some way, whatever. And I know it's hard, like as leaders, whatever, there's been situations where in leadership, I'm like, oh my goodness, where you kind of feel like you've run out of the 10% that you can take because the other 90% isn't being taken.
Right.
But that's another conversation. But I think you can always be like, what is my role in this? Have I communicated clearly? Have we designed this? Are we headed towards the mission? Do they know what the mission is? Oh, no
Right.
wonder they're headed west. They don't even know we're supposed to be headed east. But self-management is understanding, what is my role? What is going on for me? Am I just feeling irritated? Am I stressed? Am I overwhelmed? Am I reacting to this? Am I being impatient? You know, we said earlier that we don't want to be overly patient, but if I'm truly being impatient, that's my issue, not their
Yep.
issue.
Sure
And so
is.
I think self-management and emotional intelligence is important. Also, sometimes in leadership, we are coming out of the 2.0 era, which was a very black and white era. And so we see things black and white. And so I think looking for the gray is really important, to be like, you know, you kind of alluded to that earlier, where what was going on, what was the conditions or the situation. And so as a leader, I think it's important to find the gray space between that was wrong, you made a mistake, whatever. And
Right.
if you can find the gray, I think that tips into what you talked about with the human hat. And in the human hat, I think it is important to have compassion, and it is important to ask questions. And now, I'm not saying to have so much compassion asking questions that we're going squishy. We're not being squishy, but you can open up the dialogue by saying, hey, we had talked about you finishing this project by Friday. We're Friday end of day, and I see it's nowhere near done. And I'd like to talk about that. What's happening for you? And when sorry, a cat just walked up outside the window that I haven't seen before. I got distracted. But anyway, when you look and you ask those questions, that goes back to the point that you were saying about understanding what's going on for them. And I think when we lead with compassion and we lead with asking questions, that's good. And then you talked about affirmation, and I agree with that. My favorite, oh, go ahead.
No, nothing.
My favorite on that part is the cookie approach, positive, the tough conversation, and the positive or the affirmation.
Right.
So you can see their strengths. Like I see how hard you've been working. You've been coming in every day at 7 o'clock and staying late. I know you're working your tail off. This project was supposed to be done end of day Friday, and I haven't heard any adjustments, but I see the project isn't done. So we haven't been able to make any adjustments because there hasn't been communication, and that's a problem. I need you to communicate, and we need to be able to make adjustments. So let's talk about what we can do. And then you finish out with that affirmation.
Yep.
I value you as part of the team. You are so smart and so capable, and you do such a great job on your work. I know we can figure this out. But that cookie approach is huge as far as the affirmation, which I think can minimize that emotional reaction that you mentioned when people get feedback that isn't really delivered well. So I think the cookie can help that.
Mhm.
And then I think in that cookie, when in that middle part, you're really identifying what is the problem, what is the result that got missed, and how are we going to get there? And then really you're co-designing. So what are we going to do? And you're not telling them, you're not dictating, but you're co-designing. What are we going to do about that? And that is a beautiful way to have a tough conversation, because you've been honest about the problem. You didn't go, oh, hey, I know you've been coming in early and the project's not done. Well, let's give it another shot next week. No, that doesn't hold the accountability. And I think you had touched on something earlier about, and I don't know where it was, but there was something you touched on earlier that really sends the wrong message. When we don't hold accountability, we send anti-messages for excellence. We send anti-messages for performance. And we actually teach people that they shouldn't perform and they shouldn't strive for excellence because it doesn't matter anyway.
Exactly.
So anyway, those are a few things. And then yes, of course, we talked about that with accountability and measurables is key. After you design, what are we going to do? Okay, great.
Right.
You're going to work on it this weekend. And that was your plan to come in this weekend, and we'll have it ready to go on Monday. Beautiful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Those are all good. I love what you said about the cookie approach. I think that's huge. I think it disarms people in those conversations. And the measurables are really huge too. You can't just let this go free form and not be able to track it, to show growth, allow them to show growth, and show progress. So yeah, I think both of those are really good. So
yeah, for sure. And awesome. It is hard. They're really hard to have tough conversations. But again, like I said in the beginning, for me, not having a tough conversation, you're just signing up for a bigger tough conversation. Yeah. And so if you don't even want a small tough conversation, like you might as well have it because it's only going to be worse.
Exactly. Absolutely. Well, all right. Awesome. We'll wrap things up for today. It was good to be back, and appreciate the time away, but I also appreciate today and being able to get back into the groove a little bit. So
awesome. Likewise. Next week we have a guest. We're going to have Tina White on to talk about business, finances and business. So we've never had a guest before, but going to try that out and see how that goes.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too. And I need to get back with you on that. So look forward to that conversation. So listen, awesome. Have a great weekend.
All right, you too.
We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks everyone for listening.
Take care. Thanks.
All right, take care. Bye.